Just to preface a little bit about my talk, unlike most of the talks you've probably been to these past few days, this is probably going to have the least data analytics in it. So you'll notice the title of my talk is Transforming Your Organization from a Knowing Culture to a Data Culture. So what is a knowing culture? I'm sure all of you are familiar with this concept, even if it's a new term for you. A knowing culture is one where decisions are made by leaders who are so self-assured that they need neither others' ideas nor data to affirm the correctness of their instinctual beliefs. So who are these people? They're more widely known by their acronym, HIPPO, which stands for the highest paid person's opinion, or the highest paid person in office. I'm sure most of you have seen at least one of these in your office. Often these HIPPOs come from the executive level of companies, and they come with good intent. But that doesn't mean their gut instincts are correct. What happens when a HIPPO runs your company? Here I'm using an example from an American department store. The CEO who almost ruined this company was not what you would think of as a typical HIPPO. He was a leader, hailed as the second coming of Steve Jobs. Yet he almost crashed and burned a 114-year-old department store. He burned through nearly $1 billion in 17 months, taking the cash balance from $1.8 billion to $930 million. Revenue fell by 25% for a loss of nearly $1 billion. Company's market capitalization fell by nearly 50%. So what company was this? This company was JCPenney, and it was run by this guy, Ron Johnson. So as you can see, he's not someone that you would think that you should be scared of. He was the entrepreneurial mind behind Apple's innovative retail strategy. He was the senior vice president between 2001 and 2011. He was the brains behind the Genius Bar at Apple stores. So the key issue with his approach was not that he came up with these innovative approaches to retail. It's the fact that he didn't listen to customer data or employee feedback, both of which he had plenty of, and they were all contradicting what he was telling his staff to do. He did not test, he did not validate. Why didn't he do these things? Probably because the same approach had worked so well while he was at Apple. So how do we counteract this type of knowing culture? Dan Barksdale from Netscape is credited with the quote that we all have printed on our delegate bags. If we have data, let's look at the data. If all we have opinions, let's go with mine. It encapsulates both the HIPPO problem and the primary solution of looking to data. One of the most famous organizational counterexamples to Ron Johnson's approach would be Amazon and its data-centered corporate culture. Here are the data principles they used to get their data culture right, leading them to record a staggering 800% profit increase this past quarter in comparison to the same quarter in 2015. So what did they do? They took metrics. Everything that could be measured was measured. They took every piece of data and they tested and analyzed it. So metrics become objectives, objectives become mantras, and mantras become the verbiage of everyone's job. Second, leadership. It all starts at the top. Without the CEO and his executive team supporting a data-driven culture and their own willingness to challenge assumptions that they hold dear, basically a top-down approach is the only way to break the tyranny of HIPPOs. Third, and last but not least, data democracy. This is an approach to business that institutionalizes the finding, questioning, and testing of data. Basically what this means is that everyone should have access to data. They should be able to go and use the data, use the tools to test their assumptions without the cumbersome overlay of bureaucracy. But then what? So you understand the importance of going from a knowing culture at your organization to a data-driven culture. You understand how Amazon's data principles can get you there. But what if you don't have the trained business analysts and data scientists that can help you frame your business problems and do the analytics work you require? So I want to start by discussing the importance of training programs and what an investment per employee can lead to. So one study found that an investment of $1,500 per employee in training leads to a 24% higher profit margins. So imagine if you even get half that amount. It would probably still be well worth it. Beyond the quantitative benefits, there's also the qualitative benefits of training programs, such as higher energy levels among employees, improved communication and problem-solving skills, decreased time spent resolving issues. Too often, training initiatives are considered fluffy, without any real impact, but there's real value in investing in an effective formal learning program. Is training a new concept? No, it's been happening as long as companies have been in existence. But how many of us have training happening currently at our companies? Have our companies reached the desired level of profits? Have we reached the desired level of institutional knowledge? Most probably not. But why is that? What if you could have a training program that validates your employee, where your employees could learn more productively because they're learning from their comfort zones? It motivates them, but also rewards them for gaining more knowledge. Rather than training employees during office hours, what if we could inspire them to discuss and exchange ideas from their training during those same office hours instead? Perhaps they can test their learnings from their training on the job the next day. What if you could have a training program that makes your employees competitive, but also makes them interdependent? Confused? I'll walk you through what makes an effective training program by going through my team's findings, research, and insights we collected on the journey of designing and developing Jigsaw Academy's next generation learning platform. I'd like to start by discussing the problems that I saw in how corporate training is conducted and how we can improve corporate training to mediate some of those problems. I won't have time to go into all of the problems with corporate training today, so I'm just going to focus on a few. We can discuss more during the Q&A if you'd like. So, how effective is corporate training currently? Would you get upset if you purchased a $1,000 watch that didn't work? Or spent $40,000 on a car that didn't go? What about if you spent $117 billion on something that was never really used? That's basically what happens right now. American corporations spend about $156 billion on corporate training a year. Other training expenditures such as travel, facilities, and equipment are also included in that, and it more than doubled to $28.7 billion this past year. And according to the IMF, India is projected to become the 6th largest global economy by 2020, and the 3rd largest behind China and the US by 2030. What does that mean for training spend in India? A domestic training market of $100 billion will be created, rivaling the spending of today's leading economies like the US. But what's the ROI of that investment in training? According to McKinsey, only 25% of training programs measurably improve business performance. So how do we go from this current status quo and develop corporate training that actually works? Let's delve into the problems with corporate training as it is now. First is this one-size-fits-all approach. I'm sure all of you recognize yourself in one of these 3 people. There's the frustrated person on the left who doesn't understand what's happening in the training, perhaps because she doesn't learn as fast as the instructor is going. There's the guy who looks a bit lost. Maybe he's just not at the same level as his colleagues. Then there's the lady who looks like she simply doesn't care. It looks like she'd rather be anywhere but there. So there's a lack of motivation as well when it comes to corporate training. I'm probably not alone when I say that through my many years of suffering from kindergarten to high school, I was trained to believe that learning was a spectator sport, where I was required to sit quietly, listening to dispassionate people ramble on unpredictably boring lessons. In this model, students are rewarded for memorizing endless trivia and the ability to endure long stretches of boredom. We all know this at some level. It's why people tend to sit at the back of classroom or lectures, why people check email during training, why most people hate conferences and other training events. To our general detriment as a society and industry, training has generally earned its bad reputation. So, how can an organization transcend a model that assumes all people learn the same and start moving to one where the learner can choose their own learning path and hopefully engage in a more rewarding way? First, you must recognize that individuals possess different kinds of minds and therefore process knowledge differently. Rate of learning differs. People are starting at different points. Some people are more trained than others, and some people simply don't care. They're being forced to learn, and there's a lack of motivation. So in order to cater to these different learners, you have to have different instruction, different events, different programs in order to give learners a wide array of tools and solutions so that each individual can create their own culture of learning. This is a little difficult to read, so I'll walk you through some of the important points here. This is data collected by Bersin by Deloitte. And basically what it's trying to say is that the modern learner differs vastly from the learner from the past. This is, so basically what it's trying to say is that the major takeaway from this table is that today's employees are more distracted than employees from 30 years ago. So if you see the first one, it says number of times people are online every day. In the early days of the internet, 5 times a day. Now, 27 times a day. So they're interrupted more. They prefer the ability to search for answers themselves to their questions to improve their learning. And that's what the number down below says, the 80%. They have less patience when waiting for websites to load. They do 30% of their work away from office. So aside from all these distractions that employees face in the workforce today, one size does not fit all because we just aren't built for lectures. Humans forget 40% of what they've learned after 20 minutes and 64% after just 9 hours. With little practical follow-up or meaningful assessments, some 90% of new skills are lost within a year, research shows. So what can we do differently going forward to address the varying needs of learners? We can start by looking at how to motivate your employees. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this dashboard, but basically this is the Toyota Prius dashboard. It's a hybrid electric vehicle that gives you real-time feedback about your driving habits. So being from Texas, where fuel is extremely cheap, and our roads are wide and go forever, I usually prefer to drive big cars. I know that the presenter said I'm passionate about the environment. I am, but when it comes to cars, I prefer big cars, and I like to drive them fast. But I did rent a Toyota Prius a couple times, and it achieved what no costly speeding ticket had ever helped me achieve before. I slowed down. And it's thanks to the number down below where it says average, 62.5 miles per gallon. So when you first start driving, you start seeing how, depending on how fast you accelerate, how fast you brake, that number either goes up or down in real time. So you start playing with yourself. It's like a video game. So I started experimenting with how best to slow down and accelerate in order to have the most amount of impact on the average miles per gallon metric. So what can we learn from Toyota's car gamification? Basically, that gamification that exposes real-time feedback can really work to change behavior and engage users more. So how can this apply in corporate training? Provide them a dashboard that gives them information about their learning progress. Take it up a notch beyond what Toyota has done. Add a social component to the learning. Go beyond virtual rewards. Give them real-life rewards, such as movie tickets, days off from work, Amazon gift vouchers. 1 out of 3 employees say that uninspiring content is a barrier to their learning. This means we need to try to develop training programs that entertain and inform. Not only is fun training more enjoyable for the learner, it's more effective, translating into less money spent on retraining. So what is fun training? So 79% of learners said they would be more productive and motivated if their learning environment was more like a game. 89% said that having a point system would boost their learning engagement. 82% were in favor of multiple difficulty levels and explorable content. 62% said they'd be motivated to learn if leaderboards were involved and they could compete with their colleagues. So adding gamification to e-learning gives learners the boost in motivation they need to become active participants in their own learning process. It also serves as an incentive for those who may be more competitive in nature. But what exactly is gamification? So this was the definition of gamification that I liked best. It captures the idea that elements of games, such as game-based mechanics, aesthetics, and game thinking, can be infused into instructional situations within corporate environments to provide positive learning outcomes without having to create a full-blown game. To the effect of engaging people, motivating action, promoting learning, and solving problems. But is it even effective? Do people learn better with gamification? So according to a University of Colorado study on the impact of games and simulations on adult learners, participants in gamified e-learning experiences scored higher than those in non-gamified e-learning. 14% scored higher in skill-based knowledge assessments, 11% scored higher in terms of factual knowledge. And the really great stat here is that they had a 9% increase in retention rate, because if you remember before, I'd also said that most people forget 90% of what they've learned in corporate training in a year's time. Another problem in corporate training is that many organizations don't evaluate how well employees have learned. In order to evaluate your employees properly, you will also need very clear and precise learning objectives. By having learning objectives laid out for your employees, you can test whether or not the material that they've gone through and that they've supposedly learned has been met by with the learning objectives. So in order to do this, testing is an integral part of any training. As I noted earlier, learners only retain 10% of what they've learned in training a year later. In order to recognize the skills decay, assessment should be done on a continuous basis. If you don't use the skills you've learned very quickly, you will have a correspondingly big delay quickly. And that you can see in this graph here. So what this illustrates is that you can have the best training in the world, but if your organization doesn't set the right conditions so that when employees go back to their jobs, they have the right supervisory support, the opportunity to practice, and the conditions that allow them to apply the skills they just learned, then it's all for nothing. Your employees must have an opportunity to practice their new skills, preferably with the same environment that they would be using in the real world. So if you learn something and you don't have the opportunity to apply what you've learned, eventually you're going to lose it. Additionally, employees cannot memorize everything, even if they wanted to. Companies need to give employees access to the information they will need. The learning platforms, databases, manuals, checklists, cheat sheets, whatever it is, whenever it's needed on the job. Let's face it, training sessions are often like cram sessions, full of information and facts. When employees are inundated with facts and concepts, they will forget 90% of it. Companies need to teach employees how and where to access the facts so that they can update and revise what they've learned previously. So what training models are used in corporate training today? There are 3 main models, but one is becoming the standout. The first one is just-in-case learning. It's content-centric. So these types of programs have been there for several hundreds of years. It's where you learn something in case you might need to use it someday, where one course can be canned to teach many people what they might need to know. It's a one-to-many model. This is the one-size-fits-all approach, where one instructor teaches many students from one off-the-shelf program. The second is probably where we are right now. It's called just-in-time learning, and it's learner-centric. This is where learners get the information only when and where they need it, and it assumes that learners know what they need to learn and can find it when they need it. The third is the one that's becoming the standout, and it's called just-for-me learning, and this one is business-centric. So this is the one that 40% of US organizations are currently using, and it's the type of learning where it's aligned with the goals of the business. So it requires you to do a needs assessment before you go into training to make sure that it aligns with the goals of your organization. So this is largely seen as the emerging model for L&D and will become the majority soon. Why will this become the majority? The reason is simple. The needs of the business must be the driving force for learning in the organization. Significant business outcomes have been reported by top learning companies. So those in the top 10% of performers who follow their business needs and use the evidence of their own performance to drive success. When these companies align their learning decisions based on business decisions and desired business outcomes, as seen in Just For Me Learning, they have been 13 times more likely to report increased revenue, 9 times more likely to report increased productivity, and 5 times more likely to report improved customer satisfaction as a benefit. 50% more likely to have noticed positive changes in staff behavior as well. So while we can bring innovations from education, such as e-learning, gamification, better and more frequent skills assessment, and opportunities for real-world practice, in the end, combining these innovations with a data-driven culture and change in training models will lead to the biggest returns on your learning and development investments. So that's all. If you guys have any questions, feel free. Go ahead.
Management now feels that people ready for deployment.
I'm sorry?
Management now feels that people ready for deployment, not taking them and training. What is your view?
What is ready for deployment?
That is, once the employees are employed, they are ready for deployment to productive work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem.
Otherwise, there is no time for training.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the problem. I think that a lot of the L&D strategy is they take an untrained employee, they throw him in training, and they expect an immediate, like when the person comes out of that training, that they're just going to be perfectly trained and that they can be deployed into a project immediately. But that's sort of one of the biggest myths in L&D, in the L&D world. That's impossible. You have to give continued support because by the end of the day, after the training, a lot of the knowledge is gone. So you need to give that support so that it doesn't disappear immediately. So that's why I think you need to provide the materials because no one can memorize these things. I think the better approach is to teach people how to think and how to get the information. Like, where do you go find the information? Where do you find these data analytics techniques that you can use later on? So you do learn how to use them, but you also learn where can I go and find resources for them. So I think that's the better approach, and I think that that's something that a lot of people are missing.
You have given a slide. Training input is retained for about an hour. After that, when it is not practiced, it declines.
Exactly. Yeah, practice.
What is the basis of that finding?
Why does it decay? Skills decay?
What is the basis of that finding? Is
Ba-
it from your data?
No, so what we found through the data, I mean, so what we have is more qualitative data, qualitative data. And so then what I did is I went and looked for quantitative data that also backed up what we found through our user research. So yeah, what people were saying is that they really prefer having some sort of repository where they can search for any topics that they're interested in or that they need for their work right then and there. So yeah, maybe they did do just-in-case learning where they learned something just because the company said, hey, you might need this in the future, but they need to have a place where they can go and search for that knowledge later on. Because otherwise, and there needs to be some support from their supervisors as well. They need to be encouraged to go and continue doing assessments, practice. So I think that's the part that's missing. Sure. Yeah.
My question is, when through all those, the research or the reports which you have given in your slide, it says that we have so much of pros from the gamification method of training. So in spite of all these results, why is it I don't see many of the companies in India are not taking this approach of training, which actually yields more results, though at least 70% of the companies in Bangalore are based out of the US headquarters companies. So why is that?
I think it's probably because it's more difficult. I mean, so what a lot of people try to do, and they call it gamification, is they throw a leaderboard in there. And they say, okay, we've got gamification in our system. So that's like what I would call gamification light. It's not real gamification. So there's two approaches to gamification. There's structural gamification and there's content gamification. So when you have structural gamification, that's where you build a learning platform where you don't change the content, but you lead a person through the content, the same content that you would have used otherwise, but you give them rewards, you have the leaderboards, you have the social interactions. So that's one approach, but that requires a technology solution. So it's also not very cheap. It's an expensive solution. The second solution is even more expensive because it's the content gamification. So in that, you take your content and you structure like a story, a narrative, just like a video game. So I think the real reason that you're not seeing it so much in Bangalore or in India is the cost. The cost relating to that can be expensive. So what that means is that at the beginning you have quite a large expense that you have to put out in order to get the gains. I think it's worth it, but I'm not sure that the e-learning industry is big enough to support that in India yet. But I think it'll get there. As you saw, by 2020, between 2020 and 2030, India will have a $100 billion corporate training spend. Anyone else? Okay. Well, do come visit me at the Jigsaw stall, and I can give you a demo of the product we've built. Thank you.